All right. So I hope it's okay. I thought we would slightly shift topics for the moment to talk about Hanukkah. But we're going to do it through the lens of this. All right? Now, you probably have not gotten far enough in the book, or some of you may not have gotten far enough in the book to read about P.
Right.
No.
Okay? But if you need to, the bathroom's down there.
I was going to say, if he talks about it anymore,
All right.
I have to go.
So what I want to do actually is I want to look at the story of Hanukkah, because where does Hanukkah appear in the Hebrew Bible?
Numbers. It's a number. It doesn't.
No,
165. It's the number 165.
Number 165? Okay.
BCE.
That's correct. It doesn't. But part of what we've been using here in studying the Torah this way is that there are certain intentional ways of thinking about the text that go into the authorship of that text. And so we're actually going to look at it from the reverse direction. Usually we read the text and try to understand its authorship. Now what we're going to do is we're going to read a story that has no basis in the Torah whatsoever and understand how they're going to use that story to go back and find a biblical text that will support their goals. Okay, so we're going to read it in reverse. So I have two different packets for you. And we're going to start by reading two stories. One story is the traditional story that's told in the Talmud about Hanukkah. It's a story that you probably have all heard in some way, shape, or form. And then we're going to look at the story based on what we hear about in the book of Maccabees. Excuse me, where's the book of Maccabees found?
Christian Bible.
It is not, kind of found in the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Torah. The Vulgate is the Latin translation of the Torah, or of the Bible. But in the Bible, and by Bible now I'm going to use broad stroke Bible, not Hebrew Bible, there's a section called the Apocrypha. What is the Apocrypha?
Like appendices.
Okay, it's like appendices, kind of.
So bits and pieces of things.
There is bits and pieces of things.
Aren't these collections that were essentially obtained after the Hebrew Bible itself was canonized?
Yes, for sure. Although they may have started collecting them even before the canonization took place. Yeah.
In Greek, it means secrets.
Yes, in Greek it means secrets. That's why we have Mike here. He is our token Greek who will help us understand this. And as a way of being able to show good faith, Mike has volunteered to go to battle with us today, and has already said that he would lose. So we appreciate that. The Apocrypha are stories that are told about groups of people or individual people, and the books are often given the title of the name of the person whom they're about, but they may or may not be exactly about that person. So it just so happens there's a book in the Apocrypha called the Maccabees. There's actually 4 different books in the Maccabees. And so who do you think the book of Maccabees is about? The Maccabees. However, it's not clear that the Maccabees was actually written by the Maccabees. There's other books like the book of Judith and the book of Tobit and a book of several others where they're titled by that person's name or that group's name, but they may or may not have been written by that group. So we're going to look at the story of Hanukkah told in the Talmud. And remember, the Talmud is written sometime between the 3rd and 7th century of the Common Era. The Mishnah, so just to give you a brief timeline, in 587-86, Temple 1 is destroyed. We'll use this as 0. So this over here is BCE, and this over here is CE. In 200 of the Common Era, the Mishnah is compiled and redacted by Rabbi Judah the Prince. What happens in 70?
Destruction of the second temple.
And then from about 200 on, till about 700, roughly, we have both the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds. When does Hanukkah take place?
165 PCE.
Who said no way?
No,
Go
I
ahead.
was wrong.
You were wrong?
Yes.
Oh.
It's around there.
Yeah, roughly. Okay, roughly. And by the way, Hanukkah is actually not a finite event, right? It was a war that was going on for several years that was taking place over this period of time. Sometime around 332 BCE, who's in power?
Alexander,
That's it.
Right.
the Greeks.
And over here in 538, we have the Persians. Right, Cyrus, exactly.
Where's
And then from here on, we're going to have the Romans. Okay? So that's our very quick, brief timeline of history. And so most likely the story of Hanukkah is taking place sometime after Alexander comes into power and before the Romans come to power. Right? Because it's a story about the Greeks, in particular the Seleucid Greeks. The question, though, is that what is the story of Hanukkah actually about? So we're going to look at two stories. The first one is the Talmudic story. Now, mind you, for a moment, I'm giving you the story that's written later first, not the story that's written earlier. So let's read the way that the rabbis capture Hanukkah. So if you're looking at your packet, I'm on page 1. It says Babylonian Talmud Tractate Shabbat, 21b to 22a. Lou, you want to read?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Our rabbis taught the precept of Hanukkah demands one light for a man and his household. The zealous kindle a light for each member of the household, and the extremely zealous Beth Shammai maintain on the first day 8 lights are lit, and thereafter they are gradually reduced. But Beth Hillel say on the first day 1 is lit, and thereafter they are progressively increased.
Okay, so the Talmud's telling us the story that the law is that at the very least, one person, the man, lights the Hanukkah candles on behalf of his household. And if you're really, really pious, then you can really light one for each member of the household. But if you're even more pious, according to Shammai, you start with 8 candles and you take away 1 each day. And according to Hillel, you start with 1 and you add 1 each day. Which one do we follow? That's right. Okay, so, keep going.
Ulas said, in the West Palestine, 2 Amorim, Rav Joseph ben Jose ben Abin and Rav Joseph ben Zabida, differ therein. One maintains the reason of Beth Shammai is that it shall correspond to the days still to come, and that of Beth Hillel is that it shall correspond to the days that are gone.
All right, so we have Amoraim. Amoraim are the later rabbis, the Tanaim are the earlier rabbis. So the later rabbis are trying to understand what's the logic behind Hillel and Shammai. Oh, it must mean that if Shammai starts with 8 and takes away 1, he's telling you how many days of Hanukkah are left. We've got 8 days, now we've got 7 days left, then we have 6, then we have 5, then we have 4, etc. But for Hillel, no. We want to be able to see how many days we have more to come. Right? So today's the first day, then we're going to add another day, then we're going to add another day, so going up. That's one interpretation of their explanation. And what's the other one, Lou? But another maintains?
But another maintains, Beth Shammai's reason is that it shall correspond to the bullocks of the festival, whilst Beth Hillel's reason is that we promote in matters of sanctity, but do not reduce.
Okay, Shammai wants to suggest that perhaps it lets us know about sacrifices. On Hanukkah, they offered sacrifices of some sort. Now, we're going to keep in mind this idea of a bullock for a little bit later. We're going to come back to it. But Hillel says, no, we do what's called ma'alin b'kodesh ve'enu moridim. We always want to elevate ourselves in holiness. So the way that we do that is that we add. We don't take away. That's what his argument is. All right, so that's one part of the Hanukkah story, according to the Talmud. Let's go to part 2.
Our rabbis taught it is incumbent to place the Hanukkah lamp by the door of one's house on the outside. If one dwells in an upper chamber, he places it at the window nearest the street. But in times of danger, it is sufficient to place it on the table. Rabbi said another lamp is required for its light to be used. Yet if there is a blazing fire, it is unnecessary. But in the case of an important person, even if there is a blazing fire, another lamp is required.
Okay, so the rabbis are debating where do you put the Hanukkah candles? And what's the answer?
where they can be seen by all.
Where they can be seen by all. Why?
It's good
Is it
times.
like this Passover sacrifice?
What do you mean?
Well, that you had to mark the door, for the angel to
Yeah.
pass by you.
It's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about it that way. You could probably make a connection, but not exactly the answer I think that they were thinking.
Well, for one thing, it's a display to all around.
That's right. It's a display to all around. It's called, in Aramaic, Pirsume Nisa, which means to publicize the miracle. Now, it's an interesting question. Who are we publicizing the miracle to?
Other Jews.
Well, that's one possibility.
Goyim.
Right, so that's another
Yeah, but
possibility.
they lived in little villages that were all Jewish.
Not necessarily. They actually lived in a time, remember, you're living in a time in particular that's post-destruction of the temple. One of the greatest gifts and curses of this period of time was what we call Hellenization. What's Hellenization?
Acting like Greeks.
Acting like Greeks, or if you prefer the more scientific academic term, to Greekify, right? They wanted to make them Greek. This is early assimilation. And so they were not living as Jews and as people who have other faiths. They were living together. And we're going to see that actually play out because perhaps the Hanukkah war was not simply Jews versus Greeks. It may have actually been Jews against Jews. We'll get to that in a minute.
Whoa.
Huh? Whoa, right? I know. I just found out this morning, so. Okay. All right, so let's read the last part. This is the part you all know. You probably all learned about it in Hebrew school or in kids' books, or this is a story you tell your kids or other kids or things like that. This is the typical Hanukkah story. Lou.
What is the reason of Hanukkah? For our rabbis taught,
Sorry, hold on one second. I just have to pause you. Did anyone read Cantor Daron's note about Hanukkah on the first night? So he asked, his title was My Hanukkah. What is Hanukkah?
Yeah.
That's where it comes from, right here. So what is the reason for Hanukkah? In the Aramaic it says My Hanukkah. What is Hanukkah? Go ahead.
for our rabbis taught, on the 25th of Kislev commence the days of Hanukkah, which are 8 on which a lamentation for the dead and fasting are forbidden. For when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oils therein, and when the Hasmonean dynasty prevailed against and defeated them, they made search and found only 1 cruse of oil, which lay with the seal of the high priest, but which contained sufficient for 1 day's lighting only. Yet a miracle was wrought therein, and they lit the lamp therewith for 8 days. The following year, these days were appointed a festival with the recital of Hallel and Thanksgiving.
Okay. That's why you have turkey on Hanukkah. All right, so what's the story of Hanukkah according to the Talmud?
1 day's oil lasted 8
1 day's oil lasted 8 days. Why do we need oil?
The lamp.
Why do we need the lamp?
The darkest time of the year.
That's true.
What is it?
It's
The darkest time of the year.
it's required that the temple be lit.
That's right. It's required that the temple be lit. If the menorah is not lit in the temple, what does it say about the state of use of the temple?
Defunct.
It's defunct. Right? Why do they have to relight it?
Because it had been
Rededicated.
They rededicate it. How do you say dedicate in Hebrew?
Hanukkah.
Hanukkah. Okay? So Hanukkah is the act of rededicating the temple, and the ultimate way of doing that is by going up and lighting the menorah. Now, the menorah that we typically think about in the temple has how many branches?
6, 7, 7.
It has 7. How many of you have been to the Knesset in Jerusalem, the parliament? What's the symbol that's just outside of the Knesset? The menorah. How many branches are on that menorah? 7. Why are there 7 branches on the menorah?
Each day.
Each day of the week. But this story talks about 8 days. That the oil lasted for 8 days. Why is that significant? Does the story tell us why it's significant?
No, but I have one of those.
What's that?
I have one of those menorahs, and I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, me either.
All right.
Yeah.
You told us before that Hanukkah is really a delayed Purim.
Not quite. We're going to get to the
This
Sukkot thing.
says it's the Feast of Tabernacles.
Okay, so we're going to get to the Feast and Tabernacles in a second. Before looking at the footnote, is there any indication in the Talmud why it matters that it lasted for 8 days? There is none. So where does the 8 come from?
That's as long as the oil lasted.
Well, so that's one possibility, is that it just so happened that it lasted 8 days. Why else?
Could it be that they weren't sure when it started, so they needed to add an extra day to the week?
Maybe. I've also heard interpretations that it took 8 days' journey to go up to the Galilee to get more oil, to process it, and to make it ready to go. So it was enough time to get from point A to point B, knowing that the lights would be lit the whole time. But it's actually not clear in the text why it's 8 days, or why the number 8 is significant. I don't think they were waiting for a circumcision, right, which happens on the 8th day. All right, let's pause for a second. I want you to look at the blue sheet. The blue sheet is the passage that we read in our prayers on Hanukkah, evening, morning, and afternoon. It starts with the words Al Hanisim, which means we thank you for the miraculous deliverance, for the heroism, for the triumphs of our ancestors from ancient days until our time. We also say a prayer of Al Hanisim on miracles 2 other times during the year. What are they? Purim is one of them. I didn't give you the other one. Nope. Israel's independence. Now, what's interesting about these prayers is that these prayers were added later. They are not original liturgy. They were added later as a way of being able to highlight the miraculous nature of each of these holidays. The miraculous nature of whatever the miracle is of Hanukkah, of Purim. And Purim, we're talking about, when does Purim fall, if we were to date it?
March.
March? Thank you.
Oh, I thought
Persia. So somewhere in here is March of Purim. Okay? Could be February, by the way.
yes, it could.
Okay. Right? So Purim has to fall during the time of the Persians. Right? So sometime between 538 and 332 BCE. So they also wrote one for that, but again, it came much later. And clearly, the one for Israel came much later because there wasn't technically Israel the way that we recognize it today until 1948. So it is a much later emendation into the liturgy. I want to read the story of Hanukkah according to the prayer book. Okay, it's a different story. Go ahead, Barbara. In the days.
In the days of Mattathias, son of Yohanan, the heroic Hasmonean Kohen, and in the days of his sons, a cruel power rose against your people Israel, demanding that they abandon your Torah and violate your mitzvot. You, in great mercy, stood by your people in time of trouble. You defended them, vindicated them, and avenged their wrongs. You delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the corrupt into the hands of the pure in heart, the guilty into the hands of the innocent. You delivered the arrogant into the hands of those who were faithful to your Torah. You have revealed your glory and your holiness to all the world, achieving great victories and miraculous deliverance for your people Israel to this day. Then your children came into your shrine, cleansed your temple, purified your sanctuary, and kindled lights in your sacred courts. They set aside these 8 days as a season for giving thanks and chanting praises to you.
Okay, great. According to the Talmud, how would you describe the festival of Hanukkah? The first story we read about. If you were saying, the Talmud says this about Hanukkah, what would your summary be?
They rejoicing.
Okay, so we have joy. What else?
Right.
Light.
Rededication.
Dedication.
Celebration of the victory over the Hasmoneans.
In the Talmud?
In this one?
In the Talmud.
Yeah, it says
How's it?
the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled, and we defeated.
Okay, so prevail
Over the Greeks.
over the Greeks. What else?
Recite holiday.
Okay. What else?
Miracle.
Miracle. Okay, how about the prayer book one? Oh, were you gonna add one, Mike?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why are we blaming the Greeks? The entire Mediterranean basin was Hellenized.
Yes, I agree.
And it's the Syrians who did the...
Yes, we should actually call them the Syrian Greeks, is the truth. Or the
Well, they weren't
Seleucid
at
Greeks.
all.
He's defending the Greeks.
I'm actually going to take the Greeks out of it altogether in a few minutes. So if you want to wait one moment, we'll get there. All right, what's the prayer book version of the story?
Jews were abandoning the Torah and
It's
the
God.
mitzvot.
Leading the victory.
God. What else?
The Jews were doing the wrong thing.
Okay, not following mitzvot. What else? Who are the actors in the ritual in the prayer book story?
Kohen.
The priests. Okay. Why do we light for 8 days according to this story? I mean, according to the prayer book story.
Doesn't say.
It doesn't say.
Paul says they set aside the 8
They
days.
just set aside 8 days. So now if we look at the 8 part, this is the oil lasted 8 days. Whereas this one,
Because
Nothing.
8 days to celebrate. There's no oil mentioned really in this ritual one, in the prayer book one. Okay, 2 stories. Now, to Mike's point, turn your page to page 2 and page 3, and we're going to look at some excerpts from the book of Maccabees. It is not exactly clear who wrote Maccabees. Some say that it was Josephus. Some say that it was a bunch of authors. And some say that it was written either shortly thereafter or within just centuries after. So it's not exactly clear when the story is being told. Now, to Mike's point about the Greeks versus the Syrian Greeks versus the Seleucid Greeks versus whatever, there's another perhaps part of the story that we need to think about. Who is the war between?
Between the Zealots and the Hellenized Jews.
Good. So the Zealots versus Hellenized Jews. Who are the Zealots?
The believers.
What does that mean? Keepers of the faith.
Right.
All right, so who are those people
Jews.
in particular?
The priest?
The priest. Who is the hero of the story?
The Maccabees.
The Maccabees. What's a Maccabee? What's a Maccabee?
Hammer.
A hammer. But who were the Maccabees?
They were probably
It's a family.
of Levites, weren't
It was a family.
Father and his 5 sons.
It was a father and his 5 sons.
Matthias.
And who was the head guy?
Matthias.
Mattathias. And what dynasty was he from?
Hasmonean.
Asmonean. And who was he in particular? Who was Mattathias?
Kohen.
Kohen.
He was the high priest. Look in the text in the ritual one, in the prayer book. It says, Bimei Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. He was the high priest. This is a story, according to the prayer book, of the Zealots, the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, the high priests, the defenders of the faith, the people who followed the mitzvot, against those who had assimilated.
The Jews for Zeus.
This is actually, what'd you say?
The Jews for Zeus.
Yes, the Jews for Zeus. I like that. This is actually a civil war. Hanukkah may not be, as Mike, I think, correctly points out, a war between the Jews and the Greeks. But it may actually be the zealots, the pious people, the keepers of the faith, the priests, versus the Hellenized Jews.
Let me play devil's advocate.
Go ahead.
Who Hellenized the Jews?
Great question.
The Greeks.
The Greeks.
Yeah, the Greeks did. But again, I think what Mike is suggesting is it Greek the way we think about Greek? Or was it a subset of the Syrian people who come to power that were perhaps influenced by Greek culture? We do know, for example, that from basically when the Greeks come to power through Roman history, that the Greeks and the Romans influenced Israel culture all across the board. What's the best example you can give me of that?
Passover Seder.
Passover Seder, right? The Passover Seder is not something we made up. We got it based on the Greco-Roman symposiums. What did they do at the Greco-Roman symposiums? They lied around and lounged around on couches. They reclined. What else did they do? They dipped foods, right? Appetizers. What else did they do?
Drank a lot of wine.
They drank usually a minimum of 4 cups of wine. They also had dessert. What was their dessert called? Afikomen. Afikomen is a Greek word. What does it mean, Mike?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, me either. Okay.
Dessert.
Right? It's derived from the Greek, which means the after dinner.
Yeah.
Right? What's that? It means baklava, right? Exactly. Okay. This is a very different. Yeah.
The Essenes appeared when?
A little bit later. I haven't gotten to the Essenes, Sadducees, or Pharisees
Because
yet.
they used to call, at that time, the Rosh Kohen was an Hellenized Jew.
Yes.
And they used to call him Kohen Arashat,
Yes. Exactly.
which is bad priest.
The bad priest. That's right.
So that was a continuation of that.
Correct. We haven't talked about the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees yet. We will, because we ultimately need to understand how does the tradition that we have in the Torah change. And ultimately what you have here is an infighting of who has the power. Not only who has the power, but who controls the way that religion is practiced. Ultimately, this whole thing is going to be scrapped, and we're going to get to... Right? The rabbinic period, if you will, is the removal of the priestly system.
What area of the country did the Maccabees live?
They lived in Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem?
Yeah, they were Judahites. Right? They were keepers of the faith in Jerusalem. Remember, one of the things that happens in 587-86 is that the temple is destroyed. When the temple is destroyed, what happens to the priestly practice, the rites of the temple? It either disappears or it becomes decentralized. People start practicing in different places. Where are most of the people in 587-86 exiled to? Babylonia. Babylonia is going to become the second largest hotbed, maybe even the largest hotbed of Jewish population after the destruction, and it's where we're going to get the Babylonian Talmud. So people start practicing their faith outside of Jerusalem. Eventually the temple is rebuilt, but as part of the rebuilding they have to figure out, do they want to practice it the way that they did before? Yeah.
The Babylonian exile was only, 35 or 50 years?
Yeah, but a lot of people didn't come back.
But it's interesting that at the time of the second destruction, we have the same story. The zealots fighting the Romanized priests.
Yeah.
And they murder the high priest, the zealots, and
Yep.
And you have the Bar Kokhba revolution,
Yes?
135 or thereabouts.
Yeah, 132 to 135.
And it's always been about zealotry.
It's always
But
been
we
about zealotry.
don't look at it as zealotry today. We look at it as
Piety.
piety. Yeah.
Yes, but if you were to look, we haven't looked at this yet, but if you look at Pinchas, right, or Phineas, in the book of Numbers, he is a high priest who comes in and he sees a bunch of people engaging in idolatrous practice or inappropriate sexual behavior, and he slaughters them and impales them. He's actually lauded by the priests because what is he doing? He's defending the tradition.
Right.
So part of what's going to happen is there's going to be this shift about who defends the tradition, and eventually it's taken away from the priests, it's decentralized, and it's given to the rabbis. Which you can argue whether or not that was a good thing or not.
When did
Are you seeing
rabbis
the
come?
same sort of thing today in modern Israel?
Yes, you could make a similar argument. So I want to look at Maccabees for a second. All right, so we're going to look first at First Maccabees. We're just going to read a portion of it, but because I want to give you a sense of the story that's told through the authors of this text. Barbara, you want to keep reading?
Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messenger to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices, and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances.
Okay, so let's pause here for a second. It said that the book of Maccabees is actually a series of epistles. What's an epistle? Letters, right? And the letters were coming from the king or from the leaders of this particular group of people, so Antiochus IV and the people who served him. And when they send these letters, what are they undoing that Cyrus the Great had put into place?
Freedom.
That is exactly right. Freedom of religion. One of the things that Cyrus promised the Jews in coming back was that he promised them religious freedom and tolerance so long as
They paid their taxes.
they paid their taxes. As long as you pay your taxes, you see me as your king, you can do whatever you want.
And say a prayer for him.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. So, in addition, we start to see this unravel, and during the time of this, we'll call it the Hasmonean period, new leadership comes into power, and they're taking all of their ritual practices away. According to this, what are they no longer allowed to do?
Circumcise their sons.
Circumcise their sons,
Sacrifice.
practice sacrifices. What else?
Keep the
kosher.
Sabbath.
Keep kosher, keep the Sabbath. Right? All of the things that they talk about in this prayer book one. Right? It says that they were not, they abandoned their Torah. They violated their mitzvot.
At least half the Ten Commandments.
Right. They stopped doing the things that inherently make them Jewish. Or, when we talked about the story of Noah last week, and we looked at the story through the lens of the animals that went on 2 by 2 versus the other 7 animals, what was the difference?
Clean versus
Clean.
unclean.
Yeah, why do we need to add them?
Because
For
sacrifices.
sacrifices. And as soon as they do that, what also happens? They enter a brit. They enter a covenant.
Yeah.
What does it mean to enter into a covenant? It means to say that you're going to practice the mitzvot.
It's a contract.
It's a contract. What's our obligation? Do the mitzvot. What's God's obligation?
Care of us.
Right, to protect us, to take care of us. We can have a whole debate about that theologically for another time. All right, but that's what the priests were trying to do. And so the priests are butting heads with the people who are following the laws of the land. But the laws of the land are in violation of, or in contrast to, that which they're supposed to be doing as Jews. I want to skip down just a couple of verses, a couple of lines, to where it says, now on the 15th day of Kislev.
Now on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king.
Okay, so they just introduced the phrase, anyone found possessing,
Book of the covenant.
what is the book of the covenant?
Torah.
So it's either the Torah,
Or Deuteronomy.
that's great, how did you get that?
Because we talked about it. The
Oh,
book of
okay,
teaching.
fine. So you're blaming me is what you're saying.
Yeah.
The book of Deuteronomy is actually called Sefer Habrit, right? There's some who actually argue that the book of Exodus has elements of it in as well. But Deuteronomy, the second teaching or the second telling, is reiterating the law that we already had from the first 4 books. Remember when we were talking about different authorship, we had J, E, P, and D? Deuteronomy is written in its own voice. Whose voice is it written from? Moses. It's not and the Lord spoke or and God spoke, it's in Moses spoke. It was said that in the 7th century before the Common Era, they went into the basement of the temple under the reign of King Josiah, and they found this lost book. And when they took it out, they realized, uh-oh, we haven't been practicing the laws the way that we were supposed to. So anyone who has Sefer Habrit, this law of the covenant, would be in violation of these laws. So what is it doing? It's actually undoing the priestly system. Don't have this, don't follow the covenant, don't do what the priests are telling you to do. And if you keep reading a little bit more, Barbara, where it says on the 25th day of the month.
On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families and those who circumcised them. And they hung the infants from their mother's neck. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant. And they did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel.
All right, now the reason that this is significant is that the 15th of Kislev is 10 days ago. Well, I guess at this point it's 12 days ago. It's 10 days before Hanukkah. The 25th of Kislev is when Hanukkah begins. So this is telling a story about a time during this period where people tried to stand in opposition to these laws or decrees. This is not so different from the Inquisition or from the Crusades or from any other time where it's essentially convert or die. Yeah.
It strikes me that in most of these cases, whenever Jews are confronted by, let's say, terrible choices between conform to the rules of the Gentile rulers, or die, or at least suffer consequences.
Yeah.
In most cases, they simply suffer the consequences.
Yes.
They don't fight back. They rend their clothes.
Yep.
Wear sackcloth and ashes.
Yep.
I always thought to myself, what the hell good does that do?
Right. Right.
At least with the Maccabees, they fought back.
All right. So now we're going to look at the Maccabees. Right now we're going to get to the crux of the story. Do you want to keep reading Bible, or does someone else want to read?
I'll read.
Go ahead. All right, Bob, we'll switch to you. We're going to go to the second paragraph. We're just going to read a little piece of it, and then we're going to get to the last paragraph. So why don't you start at the beginning, and I'll jump you around a little bit.
So on bottom of page 2.
Bottom of page 2, where it says, Then Judas and his brothers.
said, See, our enemies are crushed. Let's go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it. So they've already won the war, apparently.
Right, so this is presumably several years later. They've won the war, and Judah organizes his brothers. He's got 4 other brothers. And he says, let's go up and do what to the sanctuary? Dedicate it. Right? Clean it and dedicate it. So what's the dedication here? Hanukkah. All right, keep
So all
going.
the army assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burned. In the courts they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket, or as on one of the mountains. They saw also the chambers of the priests in ruins. Then they tore their clothes and mourned with great lamentation. They sprinkled themselves with ashes and fell face down on the ground. And when the signal was given with the trumpets, they cried out to heaven. Then Judas detailed men to fight against those in the citadel until he had cleansed the sanctuary. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones to an unclean place.
All right, so what is he doing? They're not just cleaning up the mess. What are they doing?
They're killing all the Jews who have been profaning.
Yep, they're getting rid of all of the people who had been Hellenized, who are in their way, but they do one other thing that's really important. They are reconstituting P. They are reconstituting the priestly system. He's choosing blameless priests, putting them back in charge, and they're going to build new altars and restart the process of what it means to live a priestly lifestyle. Go to the next
What does it
page.
mean, sprinkled themselves with ashes? That's not
That's
something
part of the
we do.
mourning.
It's part of a mourning ritual. It was an ancient ritual that people
We
would
don't do
take.
it today.
No. I was going to say something witty, but
Some popes do.
Yeah.
yeah, actually, there are ashes.
Yeah.
Right, so ash Wednesday
We
at the
don't do
classroom.
it.
We do not do it, no.
Yeah.
However, we often take things that are like ash and use them in the funeral. So, for example, some of you may have heard there's a Hasidic teaching from Simcha Bunim Shisha, who says that you're supposed to have 2 pieces of paper in your pockets. One that says, Bishvili nivra haolam, for me the world was created. And the other one is, Ani afar va'efer, I am dust and ashes. And the reason that you're supposed to have both of them is that on a day when you're feeling great and high on yourself, you're supposed to pull out the other one to humble yourself, I am but dust and ashes. And on a day when you're feeling low, you're supposed to pull out the other one that says, for me the world was created. And so we actually use the language of I am dust and ashes in funeral liturgy, and we use it as a way of trying to humble ourselves when we're too great or to respond to when we're feeling low. So we do weave it in, and in the funeral, they actually take packets of dirt that look like ashes, and they sprinkle it over it, and in particular, that's dirt that comes from the land of Israel. Right? And why would we want to put earth from Israel back in, or just earth in general?
Because when the Messiah comes, the bones will be raised first to
That's
the land of
correct.
Israel.
But also, remember from our creation story, Adam, or Adam, was created from
The dust of the earth.
the Adamah. from the dust of the earth. And so we return to the dust of the earth. This is one of the reasons why we're buried.
Ashes, dust.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We don't typically say that, but yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, so they put on incense, they put on the lampstands, and then if you turn to page 3, on the second line, Bob is going to continue the last 5 words, thus they finished. So on page 3, the second line at the end, thus they finished.
Thus they finished all the work they had undertaken. Early in the morning on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, in the 148th year, they rose and offered sacrifice, as the law directs, on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built. At the very season and on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned it, it was dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. So a string section and percussion.
Yes, exactly. It was a whole orchestra.
All the people fell on their faces and worshipped and blessed heaven, who had prospered them. So they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days, and joyfully offered burnt offerings. They offered a sacrifice of well-being and a thanksgiving offering. They decorated the front of the temple with golden crowns and small shields. They restored the gates and the chambers for the priests and fitted them with doors. There was very great joy among the people, and the disgrace brought by the Gentiles was removed. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at that season the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning the 25th day of the month of Kislev.
So what happens on the 25th of Kislev according to this part of the story? What happens? Sacrifices. Why? This is the day of rededication, which is what we're commemorating. Is the story that we just read from Maccabees more closely aligned with the Talmudic story or with the prayer book story? Right?
With the
The
prayer
prayer
book.
book story. Right? It's about ritual, it's about returning to the mitzvot, and it's about rededication. And in particular, what are the 8 days according to this? It's 8 days of celebration. Not only that, you're supposed to have the whole band, pomp and circumstance, and orchestra, which, by the way, will be featured this Shabbat. And don't worry about it because it says it's okay here. All right? So that's what the story of Hanukkah is according to this book of Maccabees. In the back of this packet, I gave you an article from TABS, Torah and Biblical Scholarship, called The Original Meaning of Hanukkah. And you can read it at your leisure. But one of the things it talks about is that it was not uncommon in the ancient world for there to be days of celebration connected to the dedication of a temple. Not just our temple, lots of temples. And oftentimes these celebrations would last more than a week, sometimes 8 days. So this perhaps was something that was very commonplace at the time. But I want to offer you one other suggestion, one other perspective. Bob, I want you to read the second paragraph on page 3. This is from the second book of Maccabees. It's actually suggested that the second book of Maccabees came even later than the first book, not just because it's after number 1, but may have been written later. And this one's going to suggest a different end of the story. Okay, Bob?
Now Maccabeus and his followers, the Lord leading them on, recovered the temple and the city. They tore down the altars that had been built in the public square by the foreigners, and also destroyed the sacred precincts. They purified the sanctuary and made another altar of sacrifice.
Okay, so that's more or less the same. Skip down to where it's about halfway down. It says, "It happened that on the same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned."
By the foreigners.
Yep.
The purification of the sanctuary took place. That is, on the 25th day of the same month, which was Kislev. They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing, in the manner of the festival of booths, remembering how not long before, during the festival of booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches, and also fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. They decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year. Such then was the end of Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes.
All right, so one interpretation according to First Maccabees is that this is just an 8-day temple dedication party. What's the second Maccabees story suggest?
Recapitulation of Sukkot.
It's
Going
Sukkot.
back to the time.
Which would make sense. They weren't able to celebrate Sukkot over the years of the war because they weren't able to access the temple. Now that the temple has been reconstituted and you're just about 2 months after Sukkot, they celebrate a holiday that happens to be 8 days. And what do they do on said holiday? What do they walk around with? Palm fronds. Well, it just so happens that we Jews like to walk around with palm fronds on Sukkot. And so it actually might be that the reason that this is an 8-day holiday, and there's not enough evidence to suggest that it is or is not, but there's good likelihood that it had to do with the fact that they were celebrating the festival that they should have celebrated 2 months earlier, but couldn't because the temple was still under the control of the others.
But if
Isn't there a
all-
huge, sorry.
If all they were doing was celebrating Sukkot, why are they telling us to keep doing it?
To keep doing what? Each year?
Yeah, each year to
Ah,
celebrate
great.
Hanukkah, if it's just Sukkot that they're celebrating, like.
Good. Well, so the Sukkot part gives us a couple things. It tells us the duration, tells us that it's 8 days. What else do we do on Sukkot? What do we...
Huge number of sacrifices.
There's a ridiculous number of sacrifices, probably 70 at least in total. And what's the primary sacrifice? Bullocks. If you go back to your Talmudic story, one of the things that it says in the Talmud, let's see, where is it? Shammai says that the reason why we go down is to tell us how many bullock offerings are left. It's possible that the Talmud is trying to synthesize multiple stories. That they know all of these narratives that came before, and they want to highlight the things that are most important. Sacrifice, thanksgiving, praise, light, and there's one other major thing that they want to focus on.
Covenant.
Miracle. Right? God, in some way, shape, or form. So that's the Maccabee story. Questions about it before I tie it all together? Yeah.
Were there non-religious historians recording any of these things at that time, either Jewish or Greek or Syrian?
Josephus would probably be.
I mean, does any of this jive with what secular historians of the time?
Yeah. And if you read in the article, that it'll go through a lot of those pieces that I just went through.
And so would you also say, just another different question, they defeated both the Syrian Greeks and the assimilated
That's the
Jews?
part that's hard to figure out. They're still under, we'll call it Syrian Greek control. Like they're still under that period, governance, until the Romans take over. But they are able to restore their system of worship and practice that they didn't have before. So that could mean that they at least got back some element of religious tolerance, or I should say, or it means that at the very least the Hellenized Jews were no longer able to do what they wanted to do, which was to move away from the priestly practice.
And the great irony of this was that the Hasmoneans eventually adopted Greek practices themselves.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to tie it all together for you. We have 3 different versions of the story. We have the Talmud, we have the prayer book, we have the Maccabees. Today we tend to follow more of the Talmud in terms of the story we tell. This is a little bit more historical. There's definitely some kind of military victory that's happening. There's definitely a reconstituting and a rededication of the temple. There's definitely a fight going on between the Hellenized Jews and the priests. Now what we have to do is figure out how to take all of this and tie it together into a modern day ritual. So how do we take these things and make it a modern day celebration of Hanukkah? What are the things we do today that are inspired from the different stories we just read?
8 days.
Yep, 8 days. We kept the 8 days. What else?
Fry food in oil.
We fry food in oil.
Like
Fantastic.
the menorah.
We light not a menorah. We light a Chanukiah, right? We keep the light part. Huh?
A modified
A
menorah.
modified menorah, but the modified menorah doesn't reflect just the reconstituting and the rededicating of the temple, which would have been a 7-branch menorah, but rather goes a step further and celebrates the 8-day piece. What else do we do?
Jelly donuts.
Yeah, that's
Fried.
I'm feeling it right here. Dreidels. Why do we play
The
dreidels?
miracle.
Right, so miracle, Nes Gadol Hayasham, a great miracle happened there. They actually love to do something different. They say that the kids were playing with the dreidels as a way of distracting the Syrian Greeks from the people who were trying to practice their religion. Where else do we have a similar story? Lag BaOmer. On Lag BaOmer, it was said that the kids would go out and play bows and arrows while their teachers would hide in caves and study. Right, so this kind of distraction, now we use dreidels as a way of engaging the children. What do we do in our prayers?
Oh, we add
What did we add this morning?
Al-Hanisim.
We added Al-Hanisim and we added Hallel.
Hallel.
Right, so we kept this idea of Hallel, of thanksgiving, of joy. You're supposed to do lots of singing and celebrating. Anything else?
We have a different tune for the prayer that we like.
Correct. We've incorporated some of the traditional liturgy. Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner, but we substitute Shabbat for Hanukkah. But we create a melody as a way of creating more joy. Right? This is a unique melody to Hanukkah. Right? We sing songs. Anything else? There's one other major thing that we do.
Gifts.
That's true. Gifts came a little bit later. Yeah.
It's Hallmark cloud.
The gifts were really about how do the Jews compete in the marketplace with the Christians in terms of, Black Friday and whatever else.
What
We
is
read
the significance of those gifts?
Of the gifts,
Yes.
in general, it's a way of engaging the children.
Well, it used to be Hanukkah geld
Yeah.
and a present for the Afikomen.
Correct.
In later years, it seemed
Correct. But it was all about
Yeah,
engaging the
together.
children and telling them the story. There's one other thing that we do. We read Torah. Every day of the holiday, we read Torah. Now, from everything that we've talked about, from everything we know, what kind of Torah portion would you pick? Remember, this story doesn't happen in the Torah. What kind of Torah portion would you pick in order to be able to celebrate Hanukkah? Something about sacrifices. Good. What else?
Construction of the Mishkan.
Something about the Mishkan. Why?
Because it's dedicating a temple.
Okay, something about the dedication of the
Or
temple.
we defeat someone trying.
Maybe something about war. Could be about something about Sukkot, but in this case, Sukkot's pretty clearly defined in the Torah. This is a post-Torah holiday. Who's the authorship of the Torah portion that you would want to read? You'd want to read P. So I'm going to show you what they did. It's pretty cool. Open up your Reveal the Sources book to page 250. Wait, sorry, did I get that right? 1 second. Yes, 250. And as you're doing that, if you have the other Friedman book, Who Wrote the Bible? Some of you probably haven't gotten this far in the book. It's on page 197. This is the passage that talks about P. I didn't ask you to read this, so in full disclosure, it's totally fine if you didn't. But one of the things that is discussed in the authorship of P is that, in contrast to the J and the E, God is merciful and gracious, long forbearing and full of faithfulness and truth, storing faithfulness for thousands, bearing transgression and offense and sin. Right? So this is something that lasts and spans a long time, covenantal. And then he writes, the person who wrote P was not just changing details of stories, he was developing a concept of God. His work was literary, but his motivation was not only artistic, but also theological, political, and economic. He had to deal with challenges from other priests and other religious centers. He had to defend his group's legitimacy and protect their authority. And he had to ensure their livelihood. He also had to fight the insult to his ancestor Aaron. It is no great surprise that P does not include the stories of the golden calf or of Snow White Miriam. But the writer apparently also felt for the best defense that the best defense is a good offense. That's what the priests were doing here. They were being proactive to protect themselves and preserve their image of God. And so in the book of Numbers, there happens to be a passage of Torah that fits our bill. In chapter 7, it opens as follows. And it was on the day that Moses finished setting up the Mishkan. And he anointed it, and he made it and all of its equipment on the altar and all of its equipment holy. He is constituting the temple. And he anoints them and makes them holy. And Israel's chieftains, the head of their father's house, are brought forward, the heads of the tribes, and each one is going to go up and offer a sacrifice. Well, check that one off the box. And then if you look on page 251, verse 12, and the one who made his offering on the first day was so-and-so. Verse 18, and on the second day was so-and-so. 24, on the third day was so-and-so. 30, on the fourth day, so-and-so. 36, on the fifth day, so-and-so. 6th day, 7th day, 8th day, and it actually keeps going. 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th days. There were 12 days of dedication. Well, that also fits. First of all, we cover our number 8. And it's not an uncommon thing, even in the Torah, that there would be multiple days of dedication. And then look at verse 84. Page 253. This was the dedication offering of the altar from the Israel's chieftains on the day of its being anointed. In Hebrew, Zot Chanukat HaMizbeach. This was the dedication of the altar, the Chanukah of the Mishkan. And so we happen to have a passage in the Torah that is perfect to read. And who wrote it according to the key?
The priests.
The priests. This is a really amazing example of working at it retroactively. We took an extra biblical holiday, something that's not in the Torah or in the Hebrew Bible, and we found a passage from the Torah that fits it perfectly, not only in terms of covering the numbers of days and the dedication of the Mishkan, but of supporting the voice of the priests. And so this was a really cool, I think, way of thinking about authorship in reverse. This is the rabbis using what they know about who wrote parts of the Torah, or the way that they understand parts of the Torah, and using it to make them match between what we read and how we celebrate.
Well, it's not, but it's 12 days instead of 8 days.
That's correct. So why is it 12 days? Because there's 12 tribes. Right, so the 12 is not significant from the day's perspective. It's significant because it means everyone can participate. All 12 tribes were able to participate in the dedication. It also happens to cover our 8-day problem. That's, by the way, not Sukkot. So, yeah.
So were the rabbis who much later decided this was the passage to be read?
Yeah.
Did they do it to give more importance to Hanukkah?
More importance?
Which is not a particular holiday, but, I mean, why did they have to tie the Torah to the holiday?
Great question. Why should we tie Torah to holidays? By the way, we had to do it multiple times. Give me a few examples of times where we read Torah for a holiday that is not in the Torah. Purim, Hanukkah. Rosh Hashanah is in the Torah.
What about the modern holidays, like Yom HaZikaron?
Yom HaAtzmaut is actually when you read Torah as well, right? And fast days, right? The fast days of the days leading up to the destruction of the temple, we took a Torah portion and applied it to it. But there's no destruction of the temple in the Torah.
Right.
But we found a passage that fits the bill to make it work. So this is not the only time, but what they're trying to do is say, Torah, whoever wrote it, independent of its authorship, can somehow be applied to every single experience in Jewish history, past, present, and future.
Right, well, it also gives that event or that holiday authority.
Yes,
You're
absolutely.
going back and saying it's sanctioned by the Torah.
Totally. And by the way, Hanukkah is perhaps, second to Passover, the most celebrated holiday in Jewish history. So what better way to do it than to use it as a platform to say, Hanukkah is all about miracles, it's all about God, it's all about dedication, and it's all about reconnecting ourselves to tradition. Which is exactly what the
food.
Yeah, of course. Well, that's
Every holiday.
we got to get them coming in the first place.
Is it significant also second most celebrated in Israel?
I think so. Yeah.
After Passover.
I think so.
Yom Kippur would be-
Yom Kippur is I think, let me differentiate between want to observe and have to observe.
And how they observe.
And how they observe, right?
Celebrate and observe.
Right.
Right,
What is
right.
it?
But Passover and Hanukkah are both celebrated in home,
Correct.
and that makes us a difference.
It does. Correct. Although, interestingly, this is one of the cool things about Hanukkah in particular, is that at home, where are you supposed to light the menorah? Chanukiah. In the window. And if it can't be on the window, then it should be on your table around everyone else so that you don't cause any danger to yourself. In the synagogue, where are you supposed to light the Chanukiah? No. For fire purposes, maybe. On the southern wall.
Southern
Not know
wall.
that.
So that's the
Never
reason
heard
why
that
our
either.
Chanukiah is against the side of the sanctuary. Why would we want to do it on the southern wall?
Light?
Because that's where its location was in the temple. And so the rabbis in their law codes actually differentiate between what you do when you're celebrating at home and what you do when you're celebrating in shul. Remember, the shul is supposed to be the modern day microcosm of the temple. All right, questions, comments, thoughts? Is this interesting?
Yeah.
All right, we will, next Thursday, I'm not going to be here, so there will not be class. Yes, you should suffer. We'll have one more class, I think, on the will people be here between the week of Christmas and New Year's?
Yeah.
Okay, so we will have a class. No? No, we won't?
Show of hands.
Raise your hand if you will be here the week between. You will. 1, 2, 3, 4.
People will too.
All right, so here's what I'll do. We will have class, but we will do something slightly different so that the people who are going through the flow will not miss out too much. So everyone who is here will get what we'll call, in Hebrew, a very important word, bonus. All right? And then we will resume in the first week of January. For those of you who are reading, I would say by the first week of January, if you can, try to have read through chapter 5. At the very least, chapter 4, but if you can, chapter 5. Okay? When we get back, we're going to finish a little bit with Noah, but then I actually want to go and talk about the binding of Isaac.